Chapter 3. Every morning just after 8, he was guided out of his slumber by the same sound behind the thin wall. 2 feet from his temple, it was a clean round-bottomed ring of a tumbler being replaced on a glass shelf, after which the landlord's daughter cleared her throat. Then came the spasmodic turk-turk of a revolving cylinder, then the sound of flushed water, choking, groaning, and abruptly ceasing, then the bizarre internal whine of a bath tap that finally turned into the rustle of a shower. A slip bolt clacked and footsteps receded past his door. From an opposite direction came other footsteps, dark and heavy with a slight shuffle. That was Mariana Nikolovna, hurrying to her kitchen to get some coffee for her daughter. One could hear the gas at first refusing, with noisy bursts to catch light. Subdued, it flared and hissed steadily. The first footsteps returned, now healed. In the kitchen, a fast, angrily agitated conversation started up. Just as some people speak with a southern or Moscow pronunciation, so did mother and daughter invariably speak to one another in the accents of a quarrel. Their voices were similar, both swarthy and smooth, but one more coarse and somehow cramped, and the other freer and purer. In the rumble of the mother's there was a pleading, even a guilty pleading. In the daughter's increasingly short replies there rang hostility. To the accompaniment of this indistinct morning storm, Fyodor Konstantinovich would again fall peacefully asleep. Through his patchily thinning slumber he made out the sounds of cleansing. The wall would suddenly collapse on him. That meant a mop handle had been insecurely leaning against his door. Once a week the janitor's wife, fat, heavily breathing, reeking of stale sweat, came with a vacuum cleaner, and then all broke loose. The world was shattered to bits. A hellish grinding pervaded one's very soul, destroying it, and drove Fyodor out of his bed, out of his room, and out of the house. But usually around 10 o'clock Mariana Nikolovna took her turn in the bathroom, and after her came hawking up phlegm as he went, Ivan Borisovich. He flushed the toilet as many as 5 times, and he did not use the bath, contenting himself with the murmur of the little wash basin. By 10:30 everything in the house was quiet. Mariana Nikolovna had gone away to do her shopping. Shigolev on his shady affairs. Fyodor Konstantinovich descended into a blissful abyss where the warm remnants of his slumber mingled with a feeling of happiness, both from the previous day and still to come. Quite often now he began the day with a poem. Lying supine with a first satisfyingly tasty, large, and long-lasting cigarette between his parched lips, he again, after a break of almost 10 years, was composing that particular kind of poem of which a gift is made in the evening so as to be reflected in the wave that has carried it out. He compared the structure of these verses with that of the others. The words of the others have been forgotten. Only here and there among the erased letters and rhymes have been preserved, rich ones interspersed with poor ones. Kiss, bliss, wind and linden, leaves, griefs. During the 16th summer of his life he had first taken up the serious writing of poetry. Before that, except for entomological doggerel, there had been nothing, but a certain atmosphere of a composition had long been known and familiar to him. At home everyone did some scribbling. Tanya wrote in a little album and with a little key to it. Mother wrote touchingly unpretentious prose poems about the beauty of the native wild. Father and Uncle Oleg made up occasional verses, and these occasions were not infrequent, and Aunt Kisiana, she wrote poems only in French, temperamental and musical ones, with a complete disregard for the subtleties of syllabic verse. Her outpourings were very popular in St. Petersburg society, particularly the long poem La Femme et la Panthère, and also a translation of Apuktin's A Pair of Bays, a stanza of which went: Le gros grec d'Odessa, le juif de Varsovie, le jeune lieutenant, le général âgé, tout el cherchant en elle un peu de folie vie, et sur son signe reva le amour passager. Finally, there had been one real poet, Mother's cousin, Prince Volkoshkoy, who had published on velvety paper an exquisitely printed, thick, expensive volume of languorous poems, auroras and stars, all in Italian, tiny vignettes, with a portrait photograph of the author in front and a monstrous list of miscreants at the back. The verses were broken up into departments: nocturnes, autumn motifs, the chords of love. Most of them were emblazoned with a motto. Under all there was the exact date and place: Sorrento, out to door, or in the train. I do not remember anything of these pieces except the oft-repeated word transport, which even then sounded to me like a means of moving from one place to another. My father took the little interest in poetry, making an exception only for Pushkin. He knew him as some people know the liturgy, and liked to declaim him while out walking. I sometimes think that an echo of Pushkin's The Prophet still vibrates to this day in some resonantly receptive Asian gully. He also quoted, I remember, The Incomparable Butterfly by Fett, and Tyutchev's Tyutchev's Now the Dim Blue Shadows Mingle, but that which our kinsfolk liked, the watery, easily memorized poesy of the end of our last century, avidly wanting to be set to music as a cure for verbal anemia, he ignored utterly. As to avant-garde verses, he considered it rubbish, and in his presence I did not publicize my own enthusiasms on this sphere. Once, with a smile of irony already prepared, he leafed through the books of poets scattered on my desk, and as luck would have it, happened on the worst item by the best of them, the famous poem by Bloch, where there appears the impossible, unbearable Gentilman, representing Edgar Poe, and where Couvreur carpet is made to rhyme with the English sir, transliterated as sur. I was so annoyed that I quickly pushed Serenian's the thunder-bubbling cup into his hand so that he could better unburden his soul upon it. In general, I considered that if you'd forget for the nonce the kind of poetry I was silly enough to call classicism, and tried without prejudice to grasp what it was I loved so much, he would have understood the new charm that had appeared in the features of Russian poetry, a charm that I sense even in its most absurd manifestations. But when today I toed up what has remained to me of this new poetry, I see very little has survived, and what has is precisely a natural continuation of Pushkin, while the motley husk, the wretched sham, the masks of mediocrity, and the stilts of talent, everything that my love once forgave or saw in a special light, and that seemed to my father to be the true face of innovation, the mug of modernism as he expressed it, is now so old-fashioned, so forgotten, as even Karamzin's verses are not forgotten, and when on someone else's shelf I come across this or that collection of poems which had once lived with me as a brother, I feel in them only what my father had then felt, without actually knowing them. His mistake was not that he ran down all modern poetry indiscriminately, but that he refused to detect in its long, life-giving ray of his favorite poet. I met her in June 1916. She was 23. Her husband, a distant relative of ours, was at the front. She lived at a small villa inside the boundaries of our estate, and often used to visit us. Because of her, I almost forgot butterflies and completely overlooked the revolution. In the winter of 1917, she went away to Novorossiysk, and it was only in Berlin that I accidentally heard about a terrible death. She was a thin little thing, with chestnut hair combed high, a gay look in her big black eyes, dimples on her pale cheeks, and a tender mouth which she made up out of a flagon of fragrant ruby-red liquid by putting the glass stopper to her lips. In all her ways there was something I found lovable to the point of tears, something indefinable at the time, but now appearing to me as a kind of pathetic insouciance. She was not intelligent, she was poorly educated and banal. That is your exact opposite. No, I do not mean at all that I loved her more than you, or that those assignations were happier than my evening meetings with you, but all her shortcomings were concealed in such a tide of fascination, tenderness, and grace, such enchantment flowed from her most fleeting, irresponsible world, that I was prepared to look at her and listen to her eternally. But what would happen now if she were resurrected? I don't know. You should not ask stupid questions. In the evenings I used to see her home. Those walks will come in handy sometime. In her bedroom there was a picture of the Tsar family and the Turgenevian odor of heliotrope. I used to return long after midnight. My tutor fortunately had gone back to England, and I shall never forget that feeling of lightness, pride, rapture, and wild night hunger. I particularly yearned for curds and whey with black bread. As I walked along our faithfully and even fawningly sawing avenue toward the dark house only Mother had a light on, and heard the barking of the watchdogs, it was then also that my versifactory illness began. At times I would be sitting at lunch, seeing nothing, my lips moving, and to my neighbor who had asked for the sugar bowl, I would pass my glass or a napkin ring. Despite my inexperienced desire to transpose into verse the murmur of love filling me, well do I remember Uncle Oleg saying that if he were to publish a volume of poetry, he would certainly call it Heart Murmur. I had already rigged up my own, albeit poor and primitive, wordsmithy. Thus, in selecting adjectives, I was already aware that ones like innumerable and intangible would simply and conveniently fill the yawning gap, which was longing to sing from the Caesara of the word closing the line, for we shall dream innumerable dreams, and again for that this last word one could take an additional adjective of only 2 syllables, so as to combine it with the long centerpiece of loveliness intangible and tender, a melodic formula which, by the way, has had a quite disastrous effect on Russian as well on French poetry. I know that handy adjectives in the amphibrachix type, a trisyllable that one visualizes in the shape of a sofa with 3 cushions, the middle one dented, were legion in Russian, and how many such dejected, enchanted, and rebellious I wasted, that we also had plenty of trochées tender, but far fewer dactyls sorrowful, and these somehow all stood in profile, that vitally anapestic and iambic adjectives were on the rare side, and in addition always rather dull and inflexible, like incomplete or forlorn. I knew further that great long ones, like incomprehensible and infinitesimal, would come into the tetrameter, bringing with them their own orchestras, and that the combination of unwanted and misunderstood gave a certain wire quality to the line. Look at it this way. It is an amphibranch, and that way an iamb. A little later, André Belly's monumental research on half-stresses in the comp and the blé in the line incomprehensible desires to hypnotize me with its system of graphically marking off and calculating these scuds, so that I immediately reread all my old tetrameters from this new point of view, and was terribly pained by the paucity of modulations. When plotted, their diagrams proved to be plain and gappy, showing none of those rectangles and trapezoids that Belay had found for the tetrameters of great poets, whereupon for the space of almost a whole year, an evil and sinful year, I tried to write with the aim of producing the most complicated and rich scud scheme possible. In miserable meditations and aromatically dark, full of interconverted patience, sighs the semi-denuded park, and so on for half a dozen strophes. The tongue stumbled, but one's honor was saved, when graphically expressed by joining the half-stresses, ra, med, ar, cal, etc., in the verses, and from one verse to another, the monstrous rhythmic structure gave rise to something in the nature of that wobbly tower of coffee pots, baskets, trays, and vases, with a circus clown balances on a stick, until he runs into the barrier of the arena, where everything slowly leans over the nearest spectators, screaming horribly, but on the falling turns out to be safely strung on a cord. As a result, probably, of the weak motive power of my little lyrical rollers, verbs and other parts of speech interested me less. Not so with questions of meter and rhythm. Overcoming a natural preference for iambics, I dangled after ternary meters. Later on, departures from meter fascinated me. That was the time when Belmont, in his poem beginning "I will be reckless, I will be daring," launched that artificial iambic tetrameter with the bump of an extra syllable after the second foot, in which, as far as I know, not a single good poem was ever written. I would give this prancing hunchback a sunset to carry or a boat, and was amazed that the former faded and the latter sank. Things went easier with the dreamy stutter of Bloch's rhythms, but as soon as I began to use them, my verse was imperceptibly infiltrated by stylized medievalizing, blue page boys, monks, princess, as similar to the way that in a German tale the shadow of Bonaparte visits the antiquary Stolz at night to look for the ghost of its tricorn. As my hunt for them progressed, rhymes settled down into a practical system somewhat on the order of a card index. They were distributed in little families, rhyme clusters, rhymescapes. Letucci, flying, immediately grouped with tucci, clouds, over the crucci steeps of the Zgucci, burning desert of Munichi, inevitable fate. Loboskon, sky, let the muse onto the balcony, and showed her a clayon, maple, sveti, flowers, and thou, summoned nekti, fancies, in the midst of tumulty, darkness, svechi, plechi, vreshti, and rechi, tapers, shoulders, meetings, and speeches, created the old world atmosphere of a ball at the Congress of Vienna, or on the town governor's birthday. Glaza, eyes shone blue in the company of Bruza, turquoise, Groza, thunderstorm, and Strakoza, dragonfly, and it was better not to get involved in the series. Derevia, trees, found themselves dully paired with Kocheva, nomad encampments, as happens in the game in which one has to collect cards with the names of cities, with only 2 representing Sweden, but a dozen in the case of France. Victor Wind had no mate except for a not very attractive setter running about in the distance, but by shifting into the genitive, one could get words ending in meter to perform vetra diametra. And there were also certain treasured freaks rhymes to which, like rare stamps in an album, were represented by blanks. Thus, it took me a long time to discover that amethystine could be rhymed with verlistbrei, turned pages with nistboy, furioso, and with the genitive case of an utterly unsuitable pristav, police constable. In short, it was a beautifully labeled collection that I had always close at hand. I do not doubt that even then, at the time of that ugly crippling school which I could hardly have bothered with at all, were I a typical poet who never fell for the blandishments of harmonious prose, I nevertheless knew true inspiration. The agitation which seized me swiftly covered me with an icy sheet, squeezed my joints, and jerked at my fingers. The lunatic wandering of my thought, which by unknown means found the door in 1,000 leading into the noisy night of the garden, the expansion and contraction of the heart, now as vast as the starry sky, and then as small as a droplet of mercury, the opening arms of a kind of inner embracement, classicism, sacred thrill, mutterings, tears, all this was genuine. But at that moment, in a hasty and clumsy attempt to resolve the agitation, I clutched at the first hackneyed words available, at their ready-made linkages, so that as soon as I had embarked on what I thought to be creation, on what should have been the expression, the living connection between my divine excitement and my human world, everything expired in a fatal gust of words, whereas I continued to rotate epithets and adjust rhymes without noticing the split, the debasement, and the betrayal, like a man relating his dream, like any dream infinitely free and complex, but clotting like blood upon waking up, who, unnoticed by himself and his listeners, rounds it out, cleans it up, and dresses it in fashion of a hackneyed reality. And if he begins thus, I dreamt that I was sitting in my room, monstrously vulgarized the dreams as devices by taking it for granted that the room had been furnished exactly the same as his room in real life. Farewell forever on a winter day, with large snowflakes falling since morning, drifting anyhow, vertically, slantwise, even upwards. Her big arctics and tiny muffs she was taking away with her absolutely everything, including the park where they used to meet in summer. There remained only his rhymed inventory, plus the briefcase under his arm, the shabby briefcase of an upper former who had skipped school. An odd constraint, the desire to say something important, silence, vague, insignificant words. Love, to put it simply, repeats at the last parting the musical theme of shyness that precedes at first avowal. The reticulate touch of her salty lips through the veil. At the station there was a vile animal bustle. This was the time when the black and white seeds of the flower of happiness, sunshine, and freedom were being liberally sown. Now it is grown up. Russia is populated with sunflowers. This is the largest, most fat-faced, and stupidest of flowers. Poems, about parting, about death, about the past. It is impossible to define, but it seems that happened abroad. The exact period of change in my attitude to writing poetry, when I became sick of the workshop, the classification of words, and the collection of rhymes. But how excruciatingly difficult it was to break, scatter, and forget all that. Faulty habits clung firmly. Words accustomed to go together did not want to be uncoupled. In themselves they were neither bad nor good, but their combination in groups, the mutual guarantee of rhymes, the rank-grown rhythms, all this made them foul, hideous, and dead. To consider himself a mediocrity was hardly any better than believing he was a genius. Fedor doubted the first and conceded the second. But more important, strove not to surrender to the fiendish despair of a blank sheet, since there were things he wanted to express just as naturally and unrestrainedly as the lungs want to expand, hence words suitable for breathing ought to exist. The oft-repeated complaints of poets, alas, no words are available, that words are pale corpses, that words are incapable of expressing our thingamabob feelings, and to prove it a torrent of trochaic hexameters is set loose, seemed to him just as senseless as the staid conviction of the eldest inhabitant of a mountain hamlet that yonder mountain has never been climbed by anyone and never will be. One fine cold morning a long lean Englishman appears and cheerfully scrambles up to the top. The first feeling of liberation stirred in him when he was working on the little volume of poems published 2 years ago now. It had remained in his consciousness as a pleasant exercise, one or two of those 50 octaves, it was true, he was now ashamed of. For example, that one about the bicycle or the dentist, but on the other hand there were some vivid and genuine bits. The lost and found ball, for instance, had come out very nicely, and the rhythm of its last 2 lines still continued to sing in his ear, with the same inspired expressiveness as before. He had published the book at his own expense, having sold an accidental survivor of his former wealth, a flat gold cigarette case with the date of a distant summer night scratched on it. Oh, that creak of her wicket gate, what would do? And out of the total of 500 copies printed, 429 still lay, dusty and uncut, forming neat mesa in the distributor's warehouse. 19 had been presented to different people, and one he had kept himself. Sometimes he wondered about the exact identity of those 51 who had bought his book. He imagined a room full of these people like a meeting of stockholders, readers of Godunov's Sherdintsev, and they were all alike, with thoughtful eyes and a small white volume in their affectionate hands. He learned for sure the fate of only one copy. It had been bought 2 years ago by Zina Mertz. He lay and smoked and gently composed, reveling in the womb-like warmth of the bed, the quietness of the flat, and the lazy passage of time. Mariana Nikolaevna would not be returning for a while, and dinner was not earlier than 1:15. During the past 3 months, the room had been completely domesticated, and its movement and space now coincided exactly with that of his life. The ring of a hammer, the hiss of a pump, the roar of an engine being checked, German bursts of German voices, all this humdrum complex of noises coming out every morning from left of the yard, where there were garages and car workshops, had long since become familiar and harmless, a barely noticeable pattern in the stillness, and not a violation of it. He could touch the little table by the window with his toe, if he stretched it from under the army blanket. With the sideways projection of his arm could reach the wardrobe by the left wall, which, by the way, sometimes for no reason suddenly opened, with the officious look of some fool of an actor who has come onto the stage at the wrong time. On the table stood the Lichino photograph, a bottle of ink, a lamp beneath cloudy glass, and a saucer with traces of jam on it. Reviews were lying around the Soviet Krasnanov and the Immigré Sovremny Zibitsky, and a little volume of verses by Konchiev, Communication, which had only just come out, collapsed on the rug by his couch, were yesterday's paper and an Immigré edition of Dead Souls. None of this did he see for the moment, but it was all there, a small society of objects schooled to become invisible and of finding their purpose, which they could only fulfill through the constancy of their miscellaneousness. His euphoria was all-pervading, a pulsating mist that suddenly began to speak with a human voice. Nothing in the world could be better than these moments. Love only what is fanciful and rare, what from the distance of a dream steals through, what knaves condemned to death and fools can't bear. The fiction be as to your country true. Now is our time. Stray dogs and cripples are alone, awake. Mild as the summer night. A car speeds by. Forever that last car has taken the last banker out of sight. Near that streetlight, veined lime leaves masquerade in cryosprays with a translucent gleam. Beyond that the gate lies Baghdad's crooked shade, and yon star sheds on Pulkovo its beam. Oh, swear to me. From the hall came the jangling peal of the telephone. By tacit consent, Fedor attended to it when the others were out. And what if I don't get up now? The ringing went on and on with brief pauses to catch his breath. It did not wish to die. It had been killed. Unable to hold out with a curse, Fedor gained the hall phantom fast. A Russian voice asked irritably who was speaking. Fedor recognized it instantly. It was an unknown person, by the whim of a chance, a fellow countryman, who already the day before had got the wrong number, and now again, because of the similarity of the numbers, had blundered into the wrong connection. "Say, go away," said Fedor, and hung up with a disgusted haste. He visited the bathroom for a moment, drank up a cup of cold coffee in the kitchen, and dashed back into bed. "What shall I call you? Half Mnemosyne? There's a half shimmer in your surname, too. And dark Berlin, it is so strange to me, to roam. Oh, my half-fantasy with you. A bench stands under the translucent tree. Shivers and sobs reanimate you there, and all life's wonder in your gaze I see the pale, fair radiance of your hair. In honor of your lips, when they kiss mine, I might devise a metaphor sometime. Tibetian mountain snows, their glancing shine, and a hot spring near flowers touched with rime. Our poor nocturnal property, that wet asphaltic gloss, that fence in that streetlight upon the ace of fancy, let us set to win a world of beauty from the night. Those are not clouds, but star-high mountain spurs, not lamp-lit blinds, but camp-light on a tent. Oh, swear to me that while the heart-blood stirs, you will be true to what we shall invent." At midday, the peck of a key, now we switched to the prose rhythm of Beli, was heard, and the log redacted in character, checking that it was Mariana Stopgap Nikolaevna, home from the market. With a ponderous step and a sickening swish of her mackintosh, she carried a 30-pound net full of shopping past his door and into the kitchen. Muse of Russian prose rhythm. Say farewell forever to the cabbage dactylics of the author of Moscow. All feeling the comfort was now gone. Of the morning capaciousness of time nothing remained. The bed had turned into a parody of bed. And the sounds of dinner being prepared in the kitchen, there was an unpleasant reproach, and the perspective of washing and shaving seemed as flat and impossible as the perspective of the early Italians. And with this, too, you will have to part some day. 12:15, 12:20, 12:30. He allowed himself one last cigarette in the tenacious, although already tedious, warmth of the bed. The anachronism of his pillow became more and more obvious. Without finishing his cigarette, he got up and passed immediately from a world of many interesting dimensions into one that was cramped and demanding, with a different pressure, which instantly caused his body to tire and his head to ache, into a world of cold water. The hot was running today. A poetic hangover, dejection, the sad animal. The day before he had forgotten to rinse his safety razor. Between its teeth there was now stony foam, the blade had rusted, and he had no other. A pale self-portrait looked out in the mirror with the serious eye of all self-portraits. On a tenderly itchy spot to one side of his chin among the hairs which had grown up overnight, how many yards of them shall I cut off in my life? There had appeared a yellow-headed pimple which instantly became the hub of Fedora's existence, a rallying point for all the unpleasant feelings now trekking him in from different parts of his being. He squeezed it out, although he knew that it would later swell up 3 times as big. How awful this was! Through the cold shaving soap foam pierced the little red eye. L'oeil regardat gain. Meanwhile, the blade had no effort on the hairs, and the feel of the bristles when he checked them was his fingers produced a sense of hellish hopelessness. Drops of blood dew appeared on the vicinity of his Adam's apple, but the hairs were still there. The step of despair.